Hello everybody and welcome to Nathan Unshuffled and to an exciting episode today. This is my Emerson, Lake & Palmer album rankings, the show where I'm going to go through their whole catalog and put their albums in order of preference from my perspective. This is just my own opinion, it's not any definitive list, and I know many of you will have a very different list from my own. Emerson, Lake & Palmer, I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. If you've clicked on this video, you're probably fans of them. I did a brief intro video about them called The Beginner's Guide to Emerson, Lake & Palmer about a week or so ago, so if you want to check out that video to get a bit of background and history, I would recommend it. But suffice to say, this is a little bit of a prog supergroup featuring Greg Lake, who came from King Crimson, Carl Palmer, who came from Atomic Rooster, and Keith Emerson, who came from The Nice, to form a very virtuosic trio of musicians that were one of the most notable in the prog scene in that 70s period when it was at its heyday. So a band that I've been really fascinated by and interested in, and kind of a must listen for a big prog fan like myself. And just to preface this, I do have a couple controversial things that I'm a little nervous to put out there, but like I said, this is just my own opinion, so you can definitely put your own opinion out in the comments, but this is just how I felt listening to their catalog. I'm not including Pictures at an Exhibition on my list from 1971, because I tend to stick to just the studio albums proper, and this is more so a live album. I know it's a little bit of an unconventional live album because it's not really pieces from their prior studio albums. It's this new piece, or at least a reworked version of a classical piece like they're known to do. And it's really fascinating and full of firepower and showcases their extreme abilities on a live stage. And if I was to slot it into my ranking, I'd probably put it about 5th on my list, which I don't want to spoil too much of what I have coming up, but it sits somewhere in the middle, but I think it still belongs in that classic period of the band, and because it has that same energy and firepower. But I'll admit that it's not really one of my favorite pieces from their catalog anyways, because I'm not really a huge fan of live recordings. That's probably not a very popular opinion, since many people's favorite albums by these prog bands are their live albums, but I just prefer to listen to the pristine studio versions that they intended to release. And if I want to hear live music, I want to experience it live and be at a live show. I feel like it's hard to capture that on a record. But, you know, there are some fascinating, great live records as well. So don't get me wrong, I do like several live records, but they don't tend to grab me as much as the studio recordings. And this is no exception. I feel like it's a bit raw and unpolished. There's things that just don't quite click or make sense to me. It's them at their most excessive, and there's not really any cool songs to grab hold of. What I like about their other studio recordings at the time is, yes, they went all out with some of these cool instrumental pieces, but they also had these really cool grounded pop songs as well that they were able to put into the mix to add a variety and to bring a different element that helped to balance out the album in a better fashion. But a lot of great fiery playing and really cool stuff going on in the mix here. The other controversy is I'm not going to include the offshoots of the band that came out like in the late 80s and the 90s and stuff. Mainly Emerson, Lake & Powell, which was a bit of a different kind of collective. Not really one of my favorite records anyways, has a bit of that like kind of weird 80s prog flavor that I just am not a big fan of, so no big loss there to not include it from my perspective, but it is interesting to see how it worked when they took Carl Palmer out of the equation, who was busy with Asia, and brought in Cozy Powell. Different configuration. There's also the Group 3, which brought back Carl Palmer but got rid of Greg Lake in favor of Robert Barry, and they put out the album To the Power of Three, which is actually a pretty decent record from the late 80s. Has some cool tracks on it, but it really doesn't, to me, sound like the classic ELP, much more of a streamlined 80s kind of AOR record. So not really one of my favorites either, so I'm not including those. So I'm really just going to stick to the 9 main studio albums, starting at number 9 with In the Hot Seat from 1994. To me, this is a bit of a lackluster final album for the band. There wasn't really much here that grabbed my attention, to be honest. There's some stronger songs maybe at the start. I kind of like Hand of Truth that opens the album, giving a little bit of a kernel of that classic ELP spirit. Daddy is a pretty nice, heartfelt ballad, but it just felt like this album kind of tapered off as it went along without anything that grabbed me or was very memorable. And I'm not sure who this album was really made for. What's the audience for something like this? It feels a bit too tame and poppy for the prog audience that grew up with them, but a little bit too dated and out of step for the modern pop audience to really grab hold of either. So maybe there's a bit of flashes of Keith Emerson's spirit coming out in moments through his keyboard playing, but they're very sparse, and mostly it's just kind of forgettable music for me. Never really allowed to break out and become something really special. So kind of a little bit of a tapered off ending to their career. Not totally terrible, obviously. There's definitely some pleasant pieces here, but just doesn't really work for me on a whole and isn't one that I plan to really revisit. And number 8, I'm putting Black Moon from 1992, which came out before In the Hot Seat. And I think it's quite a bit better than In the Hot Seat, but it's still kind of plagued by this late era of the band where you could tell they're just not quite to the same standards of their early material. It's a little bit more AOR tinged, I would say, a little bit less proggy. Greg Lake's voice is not really at its peak here either. So it's fine. There's some good pieces. I think Black Moon is a pretty good opening rocker. I kind of like the AOR tinged Paper Blood that follows it. Affairs of the Heart is a pretty serviceable Greg Lake ballad. And Romeo and Juliet is a cool chance for Emerson to get to do his take of his rock take on a classical piece, which is fun, even if it doesn't have that 70s firepower of some of their classic material. I like Changing States because I think it ramped up the prog factor a little bit more than some of the other pieces around it. But the second half is just a little bit sleepy for me, a little bit of that lighter fare that I'm just not as into, more ballads than I'd like to have on a classic ELP album. So this one gets relegated to number 8. Number 7, I have Works Volume 2 from 1977, and maybe you could start to feel this might be my first controversial position, I would say, because there's probably a glaring album that you think should go below this one. But I just struggle with Works Volume 2 because to me it really feels like just a odds and ends compilation album rather than a true ELP album. That's why I rank it low, because it just doesn't feel like a traditional album that was intended to be like this statement as a whole piece of music. It's just like grabbing this outtake from this studio album, grabbing this kind of extra piece from here, this bonus track, this thing, and assembling it into a fairly serviceable album with some interesting pieces to it. Definitely has some of that classic ELP flavor to it. But the quality is a little bit variable throughout the release because some things are really interesting and cool, and I'm glad that they're collected together on a record somewhere, but nothing feels super essential. It's a little bit scattered and mismatched. Some of the pieces are decent, but there's certain pieces that I was a little bit surprised didn't really have much prog flavor, which is what I think they are known for and that they do so well. There's some instrumental pieces that just feel very traditional in their style, like Barrel House Shakedown or Maple Leaf Rag. Very stuck in their typical genre without really having much of that prog embellishment and flourishes that the band is known to do on these kind of pieces. So overall, a little bit of a disappointing record. I like some of the tracks, obviously. I like I Believe in Father Christmas is a classic Christmas song, but feels a little bit weird to just tack in the middle of this release. But there's a lot of cool little items, little curios, and I think any fan of Emerson, Lake and Palmer will want to have this just to be more of a completionist. But to me, it just doesn't stack up to the other albums that are more meant to be albums, so to speak, in my head at least. At number 6, Works Volume 1 is next on my list from 1977. And yeah, I know this being below another album that I haven't talked about yet is probably the most controversial placement here, but I just have a hard time with this album, I'll admit. I think there's some great, brilliant pieces on it, but you have to really search for them. It's so long, there's so much material, it's so much to wade through. It's like ELP at their most excessive in some ways, and I really am interested in the kind of thought experiment here that the band went with, where each member of the group gets their own side of the record, and you get to kind of feel their individual flavor coming out and showcasing what makes them specifically interesting in their own style. And then they get to come together as a full conglomerate of musicians. I really like that concept, but in execution, it just doesn't really work. And it just really showcases how the band is stronger together than they are separate as individuals. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts, so to speak. That's really what this album represents to me. It's kind of like what I feel when we talk about Yes is Fragile, where it's some really great band tracks surrounded by some less than favorable solo tracks that just kind of break up the record and make it feel a bit disjointed and never are as strong as the band stuff did together. And I feel that way a little bit here. Like, the best stuff, obviously, is when they come together on the final side of the record with Fanfare for the Common Man and Pirates. And the stuff leading up to it is just variable in quality depending on your personal preference. I do actually really love Keith Emerson's piece. The whole piano concerto I think is excellent. I love classical music and I just think it's done beautifully well. One of my favorite moments. But like I said, it feels almost like it's not really traditionally ELP, so it feels a bit separate from their other catalog. So it's hard, even as much as I love that piece of music, to really categorize it on the same level as their other records. And I feel like Great Lakeside is probably the weakest here. The ballads are fine and serviceable, but it's a lot to take in on a full side. Like, I feel like maybe the mistake was giving a full side to each of these members when maybe they should have each had their own separate track or couple tracks. Maybe that would have balanced things out a bit better, but to have a full side of just Greg Lake cheesier, poppier ballads is just not really my cup of tea personally, even if they're done well. I think Carl Palmer's side is actually pretty interesting. There's a lot of really cool different sides of his playing, some interesting experimental things, some jazz tendencies. But once again, it just feels a bit disjointed and doesn't really quite fit with the album at large. It just feels disjointed and unconnected, and it's hard for me to get into. It's hard for me to sit through the album in whole because it's such a long album. It's a double album. It's almost like an hour and a half long of different material. And so I've always struggled with this one a bit. That's why it's placed a little bit low on my list, even though it has some fantastic pieces of music that I absolutely adore. Number 5, this is my controversial placement. This is Love Beach from 1978, which most people tend to rate very low. One of their worst albums for many people. This was like when they officially jumped the shark and lost all interest and just didn't really measure up to the ELP of the past. And I get it to some degree. I understand why people are down on this record. But I actually was pleasantly surprised by it. And I think it comes from my perspective as a later listener to ELP. I'm sure in the moment, if you followed ELP in their 70s, this was like a major shift and just felt like such a jarring difference to what they had done previously. But listening to it now, knowing that it was so hated by so many people, I actually found it to be a little bit of a hidden gem from their catalog. And there's some really wonderful things on this album that I absolutely love. I love Canario. I think it's one of their best pieces of music, the end side one. And the whole Memoirs of an Officer and a Gentleman is just a delight. And so much great playing from Emerson throughout the piece that keeps me captivated and entertained. Sure, a lot of the poppier pieces from the first side aren't like the premier Emerson, Lake and Palmer that we've come to love, but they're actually pretty serviceable 70s pop with some really interesting grooves and melodies that you can find hidden beneath them. I really actually like Love Beach and Taste of My Love and things like that. Even if it doesn't quite match up with the previous ELP, I find that to be really entertaining and interesting. And The Gambler is kind of in line with some of their more quirkier early songs like Benny the Bouncer and Jeremy Bender, just these really quirky offbeat tracks. So it feels like a bit of a throwback to that style. And it's just a really interesting record that I think the cover art probably deters some interest in it because it's kind of a silly cover. But the music on board is actually pretty pleasant and interesting. And I think it's not quite the disaster that everyone seems to make it out to be. But there's a big leap in quality to me from this record up to the top 4, which are all prog masterworks to me. So there's a big divide to me between their top 4 records on this list. And if you're so inclined, you can add in Pictures in an Exhibition, of course, as well. There's a big divide between those and their bottom half of their catalog to me. So let's get into the records that I absolutely love that I think are brilliant. And that starts at number 4 with Taris from 1971. And to me, the only reason why this is ranked as the lowest of the 4, which they're all pretty interchangeable because I love them all, is because I think the first half of the record is fire. The Taris Suite is just one of the premier things that they crafted as a group. It just has everything you'd want from an epic in progressive rock. and they're all playing on fire, and it's just such an incredible piece of music. But I feel like side 2 suffers a bit. It's not quite as strong as side 1, a little bit of a mixed bag. There's some really cool pieces as well on this side, but there's also some things that just don't quite work as well, like Jeremy Bender and Are You Ready, Eddie is just kind of a throwaway track to me. But there are some really cool stuff. There's some harder rocking tracks, some light prog, some cool, beautiful playing on The Only Way, for example. So it kind of reminds me of like 2112 by Rush, which has this really premier, standout, epic track on side 1, and then a bunch of other disparate tracks on side 2. Even though they're pleasant and good and strong in their own right, it just feels a bit disjointed, and it leaves me wanting more a little bit, leaves me not quite satisfied with the package as a whole, and that's why it tends to be sitting at the bottom. But out of these 4 records, the bottom, it doesn't mean it's bad. This is just one stellar record after another. So at number 3 for me is their self-titled debut, Emerson, Lake and Palmer from 1970. Really love this record. I feel like this is one of the strongest debuts by any prog band. They just came out of the gate already ready to go and creating a brilliant album. The musicianship is off the charts, and every member gets a chance to shine. There's some fast-paced rocking full band pieces like The Barbarian and Knife Edge and Tank. There's an epic track full of beauty and wonder, Take a Pebble, which is one of my favorite ELP tracks. I love how it builds and really gives space for the group, for Emerson's beautiful playing, for some beautiful Greg Lake acoustic guitar and all the stuff that happens in the middle. Just a beautiful piece of music and well constructed. And then, of course, you get the showcase for Emerson's classical stylings in The Three Fates, and a great ballad in Lucky Man, one of my favorites of their early ballads. So maybe it's a bit rough at times, this is their first record, so you can feel a bit of that rawness. But I think it brings a great unbridled energy to the table and showcases their excitement and the joy that they bring. It's an album that I wouldn't blame anyone for having as like their top tier album. Some people like that rawness and that pure energy that is brought to the table, and some of their firework playing that they have here. I think it's really all done expertly well, but it just doesn't quite match the polish and the perfection of the top 2 records for me as I was listening through their catalog. But a brilliant record, definitely essential to have in a prog fans collection, so definitely a highlight of their catalog. Next at number 2, I have Brain Salad Surgery from 1973, a seminal prog rock album full of all the excess that I love about the genre. The first side is full of these kind of shorter oddities that are all very different from each other. You get this grandiose hymn-like opening of Jerusalem, an experimental prog/classical mashup of fireworks called Toccata, the heartfelt but quirky Still You Turn Me On, and the funny honky-tonk of Benny the Bouncer, complete with like saloon piano. It's just a really diverse set of different songs, and I just absolutely adore each and every one of them. I think they're really interesting and showcase a different facet of the band and what they're capable of. Showcase that they're not too pretentious and pompous, that they're able to have fun and do these quirky little things that are off the beaten path, and I really love it. And then, of course, you get the first part of Carnival 9 leading into the other movements on side 2. Carnival 9 is one of my favorite works from the band, full stop. It's just full of many twists and turns, amazing prog workouts, 3 instrumentalists all getting a chance to shine. It's like this beautiful, perfect classical prog mashup that just takes you on such a journey and a ride. So it's a pretty perfect album to me. This is like the one I'd point to as like the premier collection from them. Like if you're trying to find the objectively just best album that the world might hold up as one of their best, this is the notable one that I think people remember from them. It's just so brilliant, and it's so cool what they're able to accomplish as a group, and has that structure that I really love of these like interesting, quirky, different kinds of pieces that showcase their personality and fun, but then they cap it all off with this big epic that showcases all their prog chops, and that they are serious musicians at the same time. So wonderful album. But to me, the number one Emerson, Lake and Palmer album has always been Trilogy from 1972. This is where I think it all comes together the best, and you get the perfect combination of different factors all coming to play. And it feels more cohesive than a lot of their other albums feel to me. It just feels like it works well. They put the track list in the right order, and it just flows seamlessly through the track listing. I really like this. And really, I think it's that consistency that sets it apart, because a lot of their other seminal albums, as I've been talking about, have these like big showpieces, these big showstoppers like Carnival 9, like Taris, and then a bunch of shorter songs that may all be great in their own right, but feel a bit more inconsistent and not as cohesive, perhaps. But this album, to me, every piece is solid and it works well as part of the whole. There's nothing that like stands out as like the premier piece of the record. It's all just excellent quality. You get the Endless Enigma suite, and I love that fugue section in the middle of these two parts of the Endless Enigma. Really beautiful, super solid. I like From the Beginning. It's one of my favorites of their poppier type songs. I think it's perfectly constructed, great, beautiful guitar playing, and Lake's vocals are just pristine here. The Sheriff is probably the fluff piece of the record, perhaps, but I think it balances progginess and silly fun better than some of the other examples of it through their discography, and I think it provides the perfect introduction into Hoedown, which is just perfect prog instrumental adaptation of a classical piece. I really love it. They're bringing that like country western kind of energy and prog flair to something a bit more classical, and I think it's a really fun piece of music that is just infectious and a joy to listen to. Trilogy has some of the most beautiful Emerson piano playing. Living Sin is an awesome heavy rocker, and Abaddon's Bolero closes the whole affair with a classical leaning piece that just increases in its intensity as it moves along. You know, it's a really beautiful build-up and a great ending to a remarkable album. Prog Perfection. This is one of the premier prog albums that I think is a essential item of any great prog collector. Just one of my favorite albums that I've come across as a prog fan through my years. So that's my ranking. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I know maybe a bit controversial, like where I placed Love Beach, but beyond that, I think it's pretty understandable and pretty in line with a lot of other people's rankings that I've at least looked up online. So let me know your thoughts. Let me know your rankings in the comments, and let me know how you felt about this video. And please be respectful and understanding. This is just my preferences. You know, I know this isn't the objective list, but this is just how I feel at this time in my life listening to these albums. So really, it's just all about enjoying the music. Ranking is really unimportant on the grand scheme. It's just what albums do you love to listen to. And I love listening to most of these records. So thank you guys for joining me, and I'll hopefully catch you in future episodes. Bye, everybody.